So we're all familiar with the concept of that somebody can be moitzi somebody else with a bracha. That I could say a bracha and discharge your obligation to say that bracha. Now, let's start with birchas ha-mitzvahs. That's the most simple one. So there's different categories of brachas. One of the categories, the two which we're going to discuss today, are birchas ha-mitzvahs, a bracha that you say at a mitzvah, which usually is Baruch Atah Hashem, some Asher Kedushanim Mitzvosav, Tzivanu, whatever it is, Laniach Tefillin, Al Netilas Yadayim, Al Netilas Lulav, Likreas HaHallel, whatever it is. That's the bracha for mitzvah. And you have birchas hanenin, which is the bracha that you make on something that you're going to derive pleasure from. For the most part, it's food. There's also the bracha on smelling things, which is also birchas hanenin. Okay.
Sons, not daughters.
What? Yeah, that's birchas hashvach. Yeah. I actually just last night, while I was searching something for this, I found an article about that, which I forwarded to myself. It seems like he had an interesting addition to what we spoke about. Anyway, so birchas ha-mitzvahs. So when somebody, so what's the pshat? How is it that I could be moitzi you with birchas ha-mitzvahs? I've already. Let's think of an example. I've already put on tefillin. Yeah, this sometimes on this time this is relevant. I've already put on tefillin. I'm not putting on tefillin now, but I'm putting on tefillin with you. Now, if you know how to say your own bracha on tefillin, then it's better that you do it yourself. But if you don't know how to, which is often the case in mitzvahim, so then there's a din that I could say the bracha for him, and he's yotze from my bracha. Now, practically speaking, when you put on tefillin with someone mitzvahim, it's like a judgment call. Sometimes you might prefer that to sort of say the bracha with him word for word as an educational thing. Let him learn the bracha, let him feel that he's done, it makes him feel special to say it himself, whatever it is. But at least in theory, and sometimes even practically, depending on the circumstances, so you say the bracha for him. Now, how does that make sense? How could I say, Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, who has sanctified us with His commandments and commanded us to put on tefillin? I've already put on tefillin. I've done the mitzvah already. I'm not doing it again now, right? You take another example on Netilas Lulav, where once you've done the mitzvah, it's done. Tefillin technically you could put on twice in the same day, yeah? But, right? So the answer is that there's something called arvus. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh bazeh. All the Jewish people are responsible for each other. So my obligation to put on tefillin has two facets. Number one, I have to put on tefillin. And number two, I have to see to it that every other Jew puts on tefillin. So long as there's a Jew who has not yet put on tefillin, I have not completely discharged my obligation to put on tefillin, and therefore it's appropriate for me to say that Hashem has commanded us to put on tefillin. I'll just read to you a quote from the translation of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. In the case of birchas ha-mitzvahs, one who is no longer obligated in the mitzvah because he has already fulfilled his obligation, can recite the blessing for another person who has not yet fulfilled his obligation and who does not know how to recite the blessing. For example, one may recite Kiddush on Shabbos and Yom Tov for women and unlearned people. The rationale is he references thing. The reference to women and unlearned people. Well, first of all, again, we're not going to get into the thing about women being unlearned. That was the fact in those days, yeah, for the most part. But the idea is because we're talking about somebody who's already made Kiddush themselves. So if I'm saying the bracha for myself, I could be married to somebody else as well. But if I've already said it for myself and I'm only saying it for somebody else, yeah, then you're only supposed to do it if they can't do it themselves, right? Again, or if there's a reason not to. For example, the minhag here is like on Halal and Rosh Chodesh, the Chazan says the bracha on everybody's behalf. Well, that's different because he's also saying it for himself. Sorry, scratch that. Right? But
like some people feed a baby. Some people have the custom to say the bracha when they're feeding.
Okay, but that's different because if there's somebody on the Bar Mas Mitzvah, there's a and that's birchas hanenin. That's a whole different subject. Yeah, But by the way, okay, 1 second. The rationale is that all Israel are responsible for each other. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh bazeh. with regard to mitzvahs that are obligatory. Hence, even a person who has fulfilled his personal obligation is still considered as obligated in the matter, since his fellow Jew has not yet fulfilled his obligation. Right? Now, with regard, okay. So that's how the mechanism. By the way, for the sources, this is in chapter 167, section 23. Okay, so that's how the mechanism works. Now, in order for that to work, I have to be actually obligated in the mitzvah. So, for example, a woman would not be able to say the bracha on tefillin for another man who's putting on tefillin because she's not obligated in the mitzvah of tefillin. I am obligated in the mitzvah of tefillin. It just happens to be that I've already done that mitzvah today and I'm not doing it again right now. But because of this principle of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, therefore, I would I can't be mitzi. I can discharge somebody else's obligation. Now, what about when it comes to Birchas Hananim? When it comes to Birchas Hananim, when it comes to Birchas Hananim, to brachos of benefits, with regards to Birchas Hananim by contrast, even though they are obligatory for one who derives benefits, right? It's not an option. It's not like you could eat an apple and you could choose to say bracha. You have to say ber priya eitz, right? Nevertheless, it's this concept of arva. So what's, in other words, the Alter Rebbe is sort of preempting a question over here. If you say that it's obligatory, if you're eating an apple, you have to say ber priya eitz, So now that it's obligatory, so there's the concept of arvus should kick in, and that I'm responsible for you to fulfill your obligation, right? Just like I'm responsible for you to put on tefillin, I'm responsible for you to say ber priya eitz before you bite into an apple. So he says no. Nevertheless, he has the option of not deriving benefit and not being obligated to recite the blessing. You're choosing to impose this obligation on yourself by choosing to indulge in the apple. So that then it's no longer my responsibility. Therefore, another person who does not personally derive benefit is not considered as obligated in the recitation of the blessing that this other person must recite and the food of which he seeks to derive benefit. Okay? So, b'meila, if I'm not eating an apple, so let's go step by step. If I'm not eating an apple, right, I cannot say ber priya eitz for you, even if you don't know how to read. Right? If you're putting on tefillin and you don't know how to say the bracha, then I could say it for you, even if, right? But if for Birchas Hananim, that doesn't work. Okay. Now, what if I am eating an apple? What if I am eating the food? So instead of me saying ber priya eitz and you saying ber priya eitz, is it legitimate for me to say ber priya eitz on everybody's behalf? So here we have a principle that says that the one who's benefiting has to make the bracha. What's the concept of Birchas Hananim is, whether you say it's praising or blessing or thanking, but it's some sort of showing appreciation to Hashem for providing this food to us, and therefore I should eat and you should say thank you for me. That's not very polite, right? So there's a concept that the person who's deriving the benefit, they themselves should say the bracha. But there is a mechanism that makes it work, and this is a halacha which is not very well known. And I'll confess that before I prepared this class, I don't think I knew this halacha. I mean, I knew this Mishnah, but I never knew how it sort of is applicable, manifest in practical halacha. The Mishnah says like this. It's a Mishnah in the 6th parak of Brachos, Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph. In the middle of the Mishnah it says, Hayu yoishvin, if they were sitting, everybody should say their own bracha. Heseibu, if they were reclining, and one person says the bracha to all of them. What's the difference between sitting and reclining? In those days, the normative way to sort of set yourself up for a meal was by reclining, like we do imitate, I guess, on Pesach, right? But the original way to do it was the couch, and everybody had a personal table in front of them. It was like there was no bunch of people sitting around the same table. Everybody had their own table and their own recliner, and that's how they ate. But so, what the Mishnah is saying is that if you're just sitting down, which in today's terms that would just be like you're walking around grabbing a snack, then everybody has to say their own bracha. But if now we're sitting down for supper and everybody's sitting down on the couch with a table, then that creates a unit, of we are all one unit having, and then one person can say the bracha for all of them. Now in the Gemara there's a whole discussion about different scenarios, but the halacha changes a little bit because of the practices of eating versus of sitting versus reclining, and the halacha is like this: that in order to discharge somebody else's obligation for birchas hanen and for bracha and food, two requirements have to be met. Number one, of course, that that I'm also eating, right, like we said before, and number two, that we all have to be sitting down, right? Now, if I'm making a bracha for myself, I'm having a cup of water, so then I'm allowed to stand and say the bracha standing up. I think that there's a minhag of Chassidim, pious Jews, to always sit down when you say a bracha on food, even if you're not saying it for anybody else. Even for yourself, if you have a drink of water, you sit down and say the bracha. That's how I believe pious Jews behave. But at least al pi halacha, if you're just making a bracha on a glass of water, there's no reason to sit down for it. But if you're making a bracha for somebody else as well, then you have to sit down. So let me read that to you again from a section of the Shulchan Aruch. Again, I'll just read straight in the translation from the beginning of Siman Resh Gimel, chapter 213. This is halacha, and I don't know if everybody, but Alter Rebbe Paskins, that's even b'diavad. That means if we were standing for the bracha, then even b'diavad you weren't yot to the bracha. You have to sit down in order to discharge somebody else's obligation with birchas hanen. You have to sit down. Now, there's raising eyebrows. It's not so common in our practice today that we do that. Besides Kiddush and Lechem Mishnah and whatever, which we're going to get to, but in just regular sort of day-to-day life, usually we all say our own brachas. We don't eat a bracha from somebody else. So first he brings the whole thing the way it was originally when it was the norm to recline, etc. And then he says like this: in the present era, when it is not at all common to eat while reclining, there's no difference between bread and wine and other foods and beverages. When people, that's referencing what I said before. When people do not sit down together in a common setting, one may not recite a blessing on behalf of another person for any food. And conversely, when people do sit together, one may do so for bread and wine as well. Okay, so don't get too carried away with the difference between food and bread and wine, because that relates to the part that we skipped. The above applies provided that all the people sat at one table or around one tablecloth without a table and partook of foods or drinks that one usually sits down to partake of at a fixed setting with a tablecloth. With regard to food and beverages which one sits down to partake in a fixed setting even without a tablecloth, e.g. wine and the like something like a snack which you don't necessarily set the table for, such a setting is established when people sit next to each other on benches or on chairs, but not when they sit separately dispersed in a room, one here and one there. So if I want to be moed to you in the bracha, we have to sit down next to each other, right? Okay.
For food.
Yes. Now, why this? What's the rationale behind this? So there's another. The Alter Rebbe says that sitting together, there's a lashon here. It sort of creates a single unit, right? In other words, the principle is that the one who benefits is supposed to make the bracha, but if we're sitting together, then we are benefiting as one. And I didn't see this anywhere explicitly, but I think a good example of that is later on in the same Mishnah. It says that that means it used to be customary that after the meal, like some sort of dessert, they would bring some sort of fragrant smelling thing that people would smell, and that was sort of the closing scene or whatever. Yeah, that's right. So there it says, whatever the bracha was on the smelling boy, or whatever, there, but it wasn't something that they passed around everyone to sniff. It seems like it was something that brought into the room. It's something that brought a smell into the room, right? So there it says that one person would make the bracha for all of them. So why by the... this is my own interpretation. I'm not 100% sure of this. But why... maybe it's from Kiddsuh? Why when it comes to the mugma to this... Right. So Tosfos brings it from the Yerushalmi. Yeah. That when it comes to Mugmar, the reason why one person makes the bracha for all of them is because they are all benefiting together simultaneously. You bring in the smell and everyone goes Mechaya. Yeah. So because it's one simultaneous benefit, so therefore one person makes the bracha for all of them. So I'm suggesting, I think this is the pshat, that the reason why if we decide to sit down together to have our food, that makes it one unit and is in some way comparable to the smell, and therefore one person can make a bracha for everybody. Yes.
So if I can do the bracha over challah for everyone at the beginning of the meal, why can't I do bircha? Why can't I bench for everyone after the meal?
So, benching for everyone after the meal, first of all, your assumption that you can make the bracha on challah for everyone is also an assumption, which there's truth to it, but we'll get to that. But with regards to benching, so strictly speaking, certainly if there's a mezuman, you can bench for everybody. One person can bench loud for everybody, but it's the practice not to do that because it's difficult or unlikely that all the listeners will be successful in paying attention to every single word that you say without their thoughts drifting off, and therefore better that they say the bracha themselves. If there's no mezuman, or for example, if it's not even benching, sometimes it's just beri nefashos or ala michya, etc. So then it's like this. The Alter Rebbe says, I'll just read it to you from the... Yeah, I'll read to you section 2, the same simon, section 213, Sif base, number 2. I'll read you the whole thing in English and you'll have the answer. All of the above applies with regard to the blessing before eating, when the group's intent is to join together and establish a common setting to eat and drink together. Hence, their coming together in such a setting joins them as one, causing them to be considered as a single unit, and one blessing suffices for all of them. With regard to a blessing after eating, by contrast, since the members of the group have already eaten and they are in the process of separating from each other, they are no longer joined together as a single unit. Accordingly, each of them should individually recite a blessing for the satisfaction he personally received. Our sage's statement, one person should recite a blessing on behalf of all, applies with regard to a meal of bread over which grace is recited, and not to blessings recited after partaking of other foods. So when it comes to benching, and he doesn't say it here, but elsewhere it explains if there's a mezuman, right? For those blessings are not as important as grace, whose importance is demonstrated by the fact that an invitation for one person to recite the blessing for the group is issued beforehand. Rabbi Samevel Benchen, right? So originally the mezuman was Rabbi Samevel Benchen, or Havlon V'Nivrich, whatever the Rabbi Samevel whatever it is, and that was a statement where, okay, let's all join together, because again, benching, the bracha achrona has an intrinsic downside. That the nature of benching is that we're finishing and dispersing this common setting right now. So in order to counter that, we precede the benching with a statement. Let's all get together and bench. And then the next stage is that one person benches on everybody's behalf. Right? Again, in practice we don't do that nowadays because, right, in theory, look, if you're sitting around the table with people who don't know how to bench, who are not going to bench properly, who are not, or sometimes you're around the table,
women and children,
right? Or sometimes even if you have English benches around the table and you have people who are not familiar, even if they'll read it, most times people who don't have the training, so to speak, are not going to be verbalizing the words. People who are not religious don't have that thing that they read with their eyes, right? So at least in theory, it would make sense for you to bench loud and be motivated to everybody else. In practice, it doesn't usually work that way. It doesn't, But anyway, but listen to the end of this. Nevertheless, after the fact, if one person recited a blessing like beri nefashos after eating, or ala michya, ala gofen, whatever, with the intent of fulfilling the obligation of the others who listened, and they had the intent in mind, so you're not supposed to do that. But v'di'evet, if you did it, they fulfilled their obligation with his blessing, provided that they sat down in a common setting that is effective in joining them together as a single unit for the initial blessing. Hold on. So it seems like they have to be sitting down. Even for bracha achrona, they have to be sitting down in order to be yotze. That's interesting. I'm not sure if it means that they have to be sitting down now, or that originally when they started eating, it's not clear here to me if it means
Why?
that. One second.
Why wouldn't it be?
Hold on.
You need to unitize the group.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's the point there.
But and it's not clear to me if they have to actually be sitting for the. Okay, well, it has a reference here for me to look that up. Hold a second. Moreover, if one member of the grandparent does not know how to recite the blessing, he should even, as an initial preference, right? I think this might be what you're addressing. Sometimes you have guests who don't know how to say B'rei Nefashos or Ala Michya. Right? So then, even L'chatchila, you should fulfill his obligation by listening to the blessing of another person with whom you established a common setting. Right? Again, with whom you established a common setting. It's not. I'll look back a second. And then he says like this. Nowadays, when people at large are extremely careless regarding the blessing after eating, the above guideline should be followed even l'chatchila. In other words, we said that it only works for the evet, but nowadays that people are careless about bench and about bracha achrona, do that even l'chatchila. I.e., one person should recite those blessings aloud with the intent of fulfilling the obligation of all those who hear him, even though they know how to recite these blessings themselves. Now, just bear with me a moment. I want to look up Kuf Samach Zayin Sif Yud Zayin. Kuf Samach Zayin Sif Yud
Zayin. For benching?
It does seem to be saying that that they have to be sitting down for benching also for bracha achrona. In other words, if I want to be moitzi b'rei nefashos, somebody else doesn't know how to say Ala Michya, and I want to say it loud, then it seems like we both have to be sitting down. And then he says that that even if they didn't sit down together, the b'diavad they yotze. Because for Rishona, primarily we hold that like the first opinion that b'diavad, that if they were standing, then even b'diavad they're not yotze. Again, it's not 100% explicit that in order for this to work, they have to be sitting for the bracha achrona, but they do have to be sitting for the eating. The reason why this is so thing to me is because often here it's not so much, but in some shuls by the kiddush after davening, it's more standing around, walking around, right? So what happens? So everyone's coming into that room to eat together, but for whatever reason, the style is that people don't sit down. There's no room for chairs, whatever it is. Yeah, I don't know. I've been once to the kiddush in Yeshua. That's what it's like, and it's very common. Yeah. So in such a thing, would that be considered that it's not a common setting for a bracha because they're not sitting down? And do they at least have to?
Talking about kiddush and lunch then?
Yes, but I'm not talking about the actual bracha of kiddush yet. I'm going to get there. Right now, I'm just talking about a bracha achrona, for example.
So somebody could go at the end and say a bracha achrona for everybody. Everybody's standing and walking around.
Right. Does that work?
That's probably very common.
Exactly. That's why it's disturbing to me that it's not clear. Okay, I'll get back to that. But okay, now where was I? Okay, so now the question is, what about Kiddush? Kiddush and Havdalah. So Kiddush is a birchas ha-mitzvahs. Asher Kiddushonim ha-mitzvahs v'rotz ha-bonu v'shabbos kol shebiavo or on Yom Tov Asher Kiddushonim ha-bonu mikolav. It's a birchas ha-mitzvahs. Yeah. In fact, when we started the class today, the example that the Alter Rebbe gave of birchas ha-mitzvahs was Kiddush. So, Kiddush and Bechel Mitzvah. But, Kiddush also has a Beri Pri HaGofen in it. So, Beri Pri HaGofen is Beri Chasanenin. So what about that? So, let's. I'll talk about Havdalah because that's the example that Tosfos gives. Imagine I'm saying Havdalah, and everybody's Yotza Havdalah for me, and then you want to have a drink of wine. So it's actually interesting. The Chabad custom is, it says in Rishima specifically that people, I think, if I recall correctly, that people should not drink the leftover wine of Havdalah. I think it says except for Yom Kippur or something.
Especially women that grow beards.
Yeah, but some men don't like to grow beards either. but so you heard Havdalah from me, and I said Havdalah standing. So the Birchas HaMitzvah element of it, you were Yotza from me. But what about the Birchas HaNenin? You want to drink a wine, or you want to smell Besamim. You pass around the Besamim, right? Pass around the Besamim, and you want to. Everyone smells Besamim, but Bermin of Besamim is Birchas HaNenin, right? And I said the bracha standing. So yeah. So how does that? So what's the deal with that? So Tosfos addresses this. Tosfos says like this. After he talks about what to do when your wife has a baby boy, he says, "Tzarich yun k'tzas mehavdalah. Misha'anim avdilim v'oimdin." Our custom is to say Havdalah standing up. He doesn't talk about the psalmim that I just threw in. He talks about the wine. How could we exempt each other with the bracha of wine if afterwards you sit down from Menachem Malka and want to drink wine? We're standing up. We're not sitting and not reclining. The Shlomo says places like this: the fact that we are making a kvias, we're sort of getting together to make Havdalah. In other words, when it comes, I have to add in some words here, and I'm acknowledging that there's probably nuanced different ways of understanding the Tosfos, but somehow Tosfos is saying that because the Havdalah, we got together for Havdalah, right, that also helps for the whole bracha. Right? And therefore, even though I'm standing up, it's considered a kvias. Even though I'm standing up, that's considered a kvias. How do you say? Creating a common setting, and therefore it's okay. It's interesting that the Chabad minhag is that even though when you drink wine in the sukkah you don't say Elishav b'sukkah, but for Havdalah we do, because Havdalah makes the wine chashuv. Yeah, it's Tamazah in sukkahs. You have to drink wine every day of sukkahs. Yeah, it's mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov. You don't say Elishav b'sukkah on drinking wine unless you're also having bread or mazonos or whatever. Yeah, but for Havdalah we say Elishav b'sukkah.
Based on that Tosfos?
No. It's just I'm just mentioning.
Because that Tosfos you could read two different ways.
So l'chayra, there's two ways to read it. One way to read it is tell me if this is what you had in mind. One way to read the Tosfos is that the fact that we're doing Havdalah together creates a chshivas, creates a common setting, and therefore, even though we're standing, and the normative rule is that standing doesn't help. I can't be moitzi you hagafan if I'm standing, but here we're talking standing, but we created a common setting. We're making Havdalah together, so that's good enough. Another way of understanding the Tosfos is that that because, and you have to, it's sort of more in between the lines than explicit, but that because this Hagafen is not a regular Hagafen, it's sort of joined on to Havdalah, so this Beri Pri Hagafen now assumes the status of a Birchas HaMitzvah, and therefore I don't need to sit, just like I could say the bracha on Hallel and discharge your obligation even though I'm standing. So this Beri Pri Hagafen, even though it's a Birchas HaNenin, it's what allows me to drink the wine, but it assumes the status of a Birchas HaMitzvah, because it's become part of the Havdalah, ceremony. Yeah. Now, I think that the Pshat, whilst again I didn't learn all the Mefarshim and the Tosfos, and I think that both are legitimate, perhaps, ways of understanding the Tosfos, but I think that the halacha we pass like the second way. Now the pshat is that it becomes birchas mitzvah. Why do I think that? Because the Alter Rebbe says explicitly that there's all sorts of scenarios. If the guys are if they're traveling together and riding on donkeys, and they have to stop the donkeys, and then one person could say the bracha to everyone. But the Alter Rebbe, in that whole discussion, the Alter Rebbe says clearly that even if I said, come everyone together, let's all have a snack together, and let's all eat the thing, if we're standing, it doesn't help. You have to be sitting down. Even if there's an explicit statement that is designed to create a common setting, it doesn't work if they're not sitting down. So, I see Steve, you're looking puzzled, isn't it?
Well, okay, so more confusion. So we say the person leading Hadalah, or whether it's Kiddush on Friday night, they say the blessing.
So one second. So let me suggest that if the question isn't addressed in the next 15-20 minutes, then ask. Okay. So
Just on my mind.
okay. So then Tosfos continues.
Something you said is we could already rediscussed.
So then Tosfos exactly. So then Tosfos says, "V'lakach, therefore, no'ev v'toiv, it's very good. L'mavdil, the person making Havdalah, v'gam l'shoimim, and also the people listening to Havdalah, sheyeshu b'shas Havdalah. You should sit down. Yeah. Because then it looks like it's a common setting. And so Tosfos says two things. Tosfos says that even if they're not sitting down, it works because the Hagafen is somehow becomes part of this common setting, but it's better for everybody to sit down. Now,
Wait, it's that's the end.
that's the end of Tosfos.
The end of Tosfos.
Now,
It's better to
sit down for Havdalah. Now, the same Tosfos doesn't explicitly talk about Kiddush, right? And let's talk about Kiddush Friday night, because Kiddush Friday night is exactly the same thing. You have a birchas mitzvah, which is the bracha of Kiddush Asher Kiddush Olam Mitzvah V'Rotzavanu, and you have the first part of Yom HaShishi V'Yichula Hashemayim Haaretz, that's just added verses. That's not essentially integrally part of the Kiddush. But before that, you have Ber Pri HaGofen, which is a birchas Hanenin, and that l'chayra is the same thing. That it would work if you say it's standing up, because the Ber Pri HaGofen becomes part of this unit of Kiddush, and that's okay. But it would be betterer to that's just because I'm in Rabbi Epstein's shul to sit down. What does it say in Shulchan Aruch for Kiddush? I'm looking in the wrong summon. It's Reish Ayin Aleph, maybe. Did I write it down? So it's Simon Reish Ayin Aleph in Shulchan Aruch. I think. Hold on. Here we go. Yeah? Okay. So the Mechaber says, the Shulchan Aruch says, Mekadesh ala kois malayayin, you have to make Kiddush on a cup full of wine, shalaya pogom, v'ton kol ma'ashaton kois, shal birchas hamazon, the cup of Kiddush requires everything that the cup of benching requires, which we discussed a couple months ago. They have to be washed out and clean. You say the paragraph of Vayichulu, you say standing up. Why do you say the pasuk of Yom HaShishi Vayichulu standing up? Because it's like we're saying testimony that Hashem created the world, so testimony has to be delivered standing up. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Then the Ramah, who is the authority for Ashkenaz, as we just read in the Torah yesterday afternoon, of Nei Yisrael Yotzim Biyad Ramah, which was coined to the play on the words that Yotzim Biyad Ramah, that we follow the rulings of the Ramah. He says, "V'yochel lamin b'shas haKiddush." You can stand if you're allowed to. You can stand for Kiddush. It's better to sit. Why can you stand, but it's better to sit? That's exactly this Tosfos, right? The Bir Gros says, what's the source for this? He references this Tosfos. You can stand. Why can you stand? Because the Hagafen becomes part of the thing, but it's better to sit. And then the Ramah says, it's customary to sit even when you say the first paragraph of Vayichulu. Right? You sit for the whole thing, and just for the first 4 words, you raise up a little bit, because those 4 words spell the acronym of Yud Kei Vav Kei, Yom HaShishi V'Yichul HaShamayim, and therefore for those few words, It's respectful to stand up, and when you start, you should look at the candles. Okay. Now, this is indeed more or less the minhag of most Ashkenazim. Most Ashkenazim sit for Kiddush on Friday night in accordance with this Ramah, based on this Tosfos, that v'yoyser toiv leishav, it's better to sit, right? There's different customs even amongst Ashkenazim as to what to do for Vayichulu. The Ramah says to sit. The Ramah says that the custom is to sit, but I believe most Ashkenazim Ari, I think this is your minhag, that you stand for the whole of Vayichulu, not just for the first 4 words. And then after Vayichulu, before Savri Maranan, everyone sits down and you say B'ei Pri Hagafen and Kiddush. The minhag of the Sfardim and the Chassidim is to stand for Kiddush on Friday night. Now, it's interesting that it seems a bit backwards, because Ari, you could tell me, but if I'm not mistaken, even those Ashkenazim who sit for Kiddush stand for Havdalah, right? You stand for Havdalah, no? I've certainly seen you make Havdalah standing.
Yeah, I shouldn't.
But
My father didn't do that, but
your father sit for Havdalah. But your father's half Sephardi anyway.
my father sits also for all of Kiddush, so
Okay, but what have you seen other Ashkenazim doing
stand.
for Havdalah?
Yeah.
So why? So we're standing for Ashkenazim sit for Kiddush because the Ramah says it's better to do that based on the Tosfos, but the original is about Havdalah, and most Ashkenazim stand for Havdalah. So that seems to be a little bit of a discrepancy, which I'm not sure how that came to be in the minhag of Ashkenazim.
But I think there's more to this sugya. It's the whole question of Kiddush Makam Suda and Edus. What do you
So
focus?
Eidos is only to do with Vayichulu, not with the second half.
Right, but some will say once you're starting with Edus, you might as well stand the whole time, and others say, well, once you're doing it Kiddush Makam Sudas, you should be sitting the whole time.
I don't know that Kiddush
And then
Makam
they-
Suda
and
is
then-
connected with sitting for Kiddush. But I don't know. But it certainly has nothing to do with Havdalah. The truth is, I'll tell you why. I just thought of a reason why. It could be that the reason why they stand for Havdalah is because common practice today is that people are not yotze the bracha of Hagafen. Nobody drinks wine after Havdalah. Tosfos is talking about a scenario where after Havdalah everybody sits down and drinks wine and has a meal or whatever, right? But nowadays that's not the norm. People are not going around drinking wine after Havdalah. And right, so it could be that's why even Ashkenazim who sit for Kiddush for this reason, right? The Ramah doesn't say the reason. The Ramah,
Havdalah might also be a Kiddush, therefore it's Edus. And
no.
And there's a shita that's...
This is I showed you the sources. Yeah, it could be there's other svaras,
Yeah,
but this is the Biagra. It's before the Shira. It's based on this Tosfos. Yeah. Okay. Now. So the question is, when you make Kiddush on Friday night, and let's say our minhag is the minhag of Chassidim to say it standing up. So I make Kiddush, and then we pass around the wine, right? Now, so everybody drinks wine. Now, there's no obligation for everybody to drink wine. It's I think the Lashon is it's a mutzum and a muvchar. It's a nice thing for everybody to partake in the wine. So, do those people say their own bracha hagafen or not? How do you do in your house? Does your wife say her own hagafen, or she hears it from you?
Shut it from me.
Anybody?
Yeah.
Yotze? She hears it from you. That's how I believe. I mean, I always make Kiddush myself, but I believe the minhag is the common practice, at least in Chabad, is that the thing that people they don't say their own hagafen, but certainly the minhag by many other chassidim is that everybody does say their own hagafen, right? And I actually I was reading last night. I looked up something, and I found somebody says in the name of what's his name. Gansberg, who he was one of the sort of attendees in the Rebbe's house. He was the shamash. He would set things up, and he was there. So he says that that when the Rebbe made Kiddush on Friday night, the Rebbetzin did say her own B'er Pri Hagafen. But anyway, those who have that minhag, those chassidim, which many chassidim have that minhag, perhaps the pshat in that minhag is that because we say Kiddush standing for whatever reason we want to say Kiddush standing, so therefore whoever's listening is Yotze Kiddush, but as far as the Birchas Hananin element, they want to say their own B'er Pri Hagafen. Also, and this is my own assumption here, so possibly, that the reason why, that when we hear Havdalah on Matzah Shabbos, so we talk not Yotze Hagafen, because nobody drinks wine afterwards, but there's two other brachas there, B'er V'Samim, which is Birchas Hananin, and B'er Eish, which I forget where, there's a lashon somewhere that's sort of a quasi Birchas Hananin. Yeah? You're making a bracha over the fire, but over the benefit that you could see with the fire, and it's customary to look at your nails, but it's not a regular birchas hanenin. It's not like anytime you look at fire you make the bracha. It's sort of a quasi birchas hanenin. So do all the people listening to Havdalah say their own Bayim Nivisamim and Bayim Eirei Ha'ish, or do they yotze from the person? So different people do different things. Personally, I always say my own Bayim Nivisamim and my own Bayim Eirei Ha'ish, even if I'm not making Havdalah. And again, I doubt I made this up myself. I probably saw other people doing it. And perhaps this is the reason, that because the person saying Havdalah is standing, therefore it makes sense to make your own bracha. Just a possible suggestion. Now, what about another thought which I've always thought might be connected to this whole sugya, is the custom that we have under the chuppah. Under the chuppah, there's sheva brachas, right? Which, right, we say sheva brachas. Now, the custom today it's not a halacha, this is just a custom to make more fanfare and excitement around the chuppah, that you call up different people to say the sheva brachas, right? You could have one person saying all 7 of them. It's not, right. So, the first of the sheva brachas is B'er Pri Hagafen, right? The second one is Shahakal Bara L'Chvoidai. Now, usually, not always, and as time goes on and we become more into making sure everybody gets honors and inventing new honors and whatever it is, so we need to bichos kainim, and somebody else is honored to hold the pole, and another one's honored to put the glass under the chassan's foot, so we need to make more honors. So often it's split up into 7 honors of 7 brachas. But traditionally, the 7 brachas are split into 6 honors. And the first person who gets called up first is usually honored, so-and-so is honored with the first 2 brachas. And he gets up and he holds the cup and he says, B'er Pri Hagafen and Shahakal Bara L'Chvoidai. Why? So, yours truly suggests, take it or leave it, that this B'er Pri Hagafen is similar to that of Kiddush and Havdalah. It's part of Birchas HaMitzvahs, it's part of the Sheva Brachas. Even though Sheva Brachas are not really Birchas HaMitzvahs, it's Birchas HaShrach, but it's not Birchas HaNanin, yeah? And it's even more emphasized under the chuppah when the normative practice, and again, some briskers have a different, but the normal practice is that the person who's making the B'er Pri Hagafen doesn't even taste the wine. Only the chassan and kala taste the wine. Right? Some, if I've seen the briskers have a thing that the person, the wine spills, and the person who said the bracha will lick their fingers to have some, to say the B'er Pri Hagafen something, but there's a letter from the Rabbi, I think, where the Rabbi says not to do that, and that all the minhagim of the chuppah are very exact, and you shouldn't be meitzilaz to say that the way we do it is no good. Yeah, but why should that be the case? So I'm thinking that perhaps the reason why the minhag became that one person gets the first 2 brachas is to emphasize that this is not a regular B'er Pri Hagafen, this is a Birchas HaMitzvah type of B'er Pri Hagafen. So or Birchas HaShrach, it's not a Birchas HaNanin dika B'er Pri Hagafen. Again, a suggestion. Okay. Now,
And therefore, not everyone has to be sitting.
right, therefore they say standing up also, right, exactly. Now, let's move on to Kiddush of Shabbos Day. So, Kiddush of Shabbos Day. What's Kiddush of Shabbos Day all about? It's just, it's customary to say some psukim before, but that's not, that's just thing. The Kiddush is say B'er Pri Hagafen. That's what Kiddush is. Having on B'er Pri Hagafen. Yeah. So, by the way, I'm going to jump ahead. I don't even know a clear answer to this. Okay, I won't jump ahead. I'll say it when I get there. So, what's the idea of making Kiddush on Shabbos Day? So, first of all, let me read you from the Ran in Pesachim, where he explains what it's all about. Okay, so the Gemara talks here about how do you make Kiddush by day. So the answer is like this. Kiddush by day is only the Rabbanon, and that's why Kiddush by night is deraisa. Not deraisa. There's no mitzvah to say it over a cup of wine, but there is a mitzvah deraisa to sanctify Shabbos when it comes in, to say some sanctification. The Chachamim designed the text of the bracha, and that it should be said over a cup of wine, etc. But by day, he says it's completely the Rabbanon. So it says the Kiddush deraisa is only by night. But why do you say Kiddush also by day? Because the mitzvah of honoring, of having a meal, of enjoying Shabbos is more by day than by night. If a person only has money for one meal, for example, right, only has food for one meal, then you have that meal by day, not by night. So therefore the Chachamim made a zeicha lekiddush, sort of. Because the Shabbos day meal is more important, so it looks funny. The Shabbos night meal, which is secondary, you start with a whole flask of a Kiddush, and Shabbos day you just sit down and eat. So in order to make a zeicha lekiddush, the Chacham said, start your meal with a bracha of a cup of wine. And you just need to say Be'er Pagafen and nothing else. There's no bracha of Kiddush, right? If you didn't, by the way, parenthetically, if you didn't make Kiddush Friday night, you could compensate by day for whatever reason, yeah? Anytime you have guests who weren't, in theory, anytime you have guests Shabbos day who didn't have a Friday night meal, yeah, you could say the whole, not Yom HaShishi, but the bracha of Kiddush, you could say the whole day. Yeah. Anyway, Shuas Cholos Kiddush Alayla. V'oid, another reason, Lefisha Einam Meshira El Alayayin, Kimich Mevarchen Alayin Tchila Shaloi Kederech Shudus, Havak Ein Shevach V'Shira. Because in general, there's a principle that whenever we praise Hashem, we say it over a cup of wine. So here we're not praising Hashem, we're just having the cup of wine, but it's sort of a way of just having a cup of wine is a way of shavach v'shira, of praising and singing to Hashem the Kedusha Shal Yom in honor of the sanctity of the day. But because it's only the Rabbanon, they decided let's not make a big deal out of it, just say Be'er Pagafen and nothing else. And then he says we call it Kiddusha Rabbah. Why is it called Kiddusha Rabbah? I actually didn't know this until last night. Why do we call Kiddush Kiddusha Rabbah? Yeah, you see. The Kiddush of Shabbos day is called Kiddusha Rabbah. If you look in the Siddur, I think it's even said, say the Kiddusha Rabbah. What does Kiddusha Rabbah mean? The big Kiddush. Yeah? Is the wedding invitations when they invite you to the Ufruf, it says Kiddusha Rabbah Acharat Tefillah. Why is it called Kiddusha Rabbah? So the Ran says that it's B'loshen Sagi Noher. Just like you refer to a blind person as somebody who could see very well, so this mini Kiddush, we call it the big Kiddush. So it's a way of spinning it in a positive euphemism.
But
exactly.
then you say it's the Iker?
No, the food, the meal is the Iker, but the Kiddush of the Iker is Friday night, and as a euphemism we call this the Great Kiddush. If you look in I'm pretty sure if you look in the Siddur, after Musaf, it says, say the Kiddusha Rabbah, right? Let's see how they translate it. In this Siddur, oh no, it just says Kiddush Shabbos Day, it doesn't say Kiddush Rabbah. Anyway, that's what it's called. It's called Kiddusha Rabbah.
So you're kind of saying it with a wink, is what you're
Yeah, exactly. Now, so basically, on Shabbos day, there's no mitzvah of Kiddush per se, but we make Kiddush anyway to make the day feel good. I'll read this to you also from the English, of the way the Alter Rebbe says it, and it's Siman Reish Peites 289. Sages ordained that one 289, number 2. Our sages ordained that one should recite Kiddush over wine before the morning meal, as one does before the evening meal. The rationale is that the obligation to honor the Shabbos during the day is greater than the obligation to honor it at night. If one does not recite Kiddush over wine during the day, the honor shown on Shabbos night would be greater than that shown on the day. Nevertheless, the sages did not ordain the recitation of the blessing of Kiddush as recited at night. Instead, it is sufficient to recite the blessing Be'er Pagafen, which is recited over wine, so that a distinction will be made indicating that this Kiddush is only a rabbinic ordinance. Nevertheless, the Kiddush must also be recited in place of a meal, and one must not partake of any food before reciting Kiddush, as is true with regard to the Kiddush at night. Okay. Now, so Kiddush of Shabbos day is just Be'er Pagafen. So basically, what is the mitzvah of Kiddush on Shabbos day? To make a Birchas Hanenin before the meal. to make a bracha, it's not birchas. You would think it's not birchas mitzvahs. It's just right now. The Brisker Rav had a chumrah, by the way, that on Kiddush of Shabbos day everybody has to drink wine. On Kiddush of Friday night, it says explicitly in Shulchan Aruch that it's a mitzvah. The person making Kiddush has to drink a maloi lugmov, has to drink an amount, a full cheek, yeah. But everybody else, they don't have to drink. It's a mitzvah. I think the lashon is mitzvah v'namuvcher. It's a special mitzvah that everybody should take a sip of the wine. But even if you don't drink the wine, everyone's yetz a Kiddush. The Brisker Rav said that Kiddush on Shabbos day, everybody has to drink the wine. Why? Because if you're not drinking the wine, then what will you yetza? The Kiddush, it is a Birchas Aden, and if you didn't drink any wine, then you heard somebody else say Birchas Aden. How do you become part of that Kiddush? Right? So therefore he says everybody has to drink the wine. Now, by the same token, I assume that the Brisker Rav would have said that you have to say Kiddush of Shabbos day sitting down. If somebody else is being yotze from you, right? Because for Birchas Aden you have to sit down. The Alter Rebbe, sorry?
The distinction you're making with sitting down, does that mean when you're saying the bracha or when you're partaking of the wine?
No, when you're saying the bracha or when you're listening to the bracha.
Uh-huh.
Everybody would have to sit down. Right? L'maisa, the Alter Rebbe says in a few places that even the Kiddush of Shabbos day has a status of Birchas HaMitzvahs. Right? Has a status of a bracha of a mitzvah. And I'll just read you one of the examples. I think it's in Kuf Samach Zayin, is the first time the Alter Rebbe says it. Right? We read part of this sif earlier on. Where we started the class, where he says that for Birchas HaMitzvahs I can say the bracha for somebody else because Kol Yisrael Harevim Zeh B'Zeh, but not for bracha of. Right. So he says, even on Shabbos, when you're obligated to partake in bread, nevertheless, this obligation is dependent on his deriving benefit from bread. For if one does not derive benefit from eating, and fasting brings him pleasure, he's exempt from the obligation to eat. So, even though having an apple on Tuesday is not, he said that's not an obligation, but having bread on Shabbos is, even having bread on Shabbos is not a strict obligation. Right? And by the way, hence, if one does not know how to recite the appropriate blessing, he should also refrain from deriving benefits, forbidden to derive benefits from the right? B'meila, we do not repair responsibility for a person. So I cannot say hamoitzi for you on Shabbos unless I fulfill the requirements of everybody sitting down. Now, I'll just pause there for a moment. The Chabad custom is somewhat unique. Many Chassidim have this minhag, but I think it's stronger in Chabad because it's a letter from the Rebbe, so that sort of boosted this minhag. That one person says hamoitzi, but everybody makes their own hamoitzi, right? Everybody makes their own hamoitzi. How could you say hamoitzi over a slice of challah? You have to say hamoitzi on Shabbos over lechem mishnah, over 2 whole loaves, right? So the answer is based on, and in this letter the Rebbe says that it's based on the Eish Avram, the Butchacher Rav, who says that the two are separate. That one mitzvah is to have bread, you're going to say a piece of bread, and there's another mitzvah that the meal should be based over a bitzia, which I don't even know how to say that in English, but sort of a partaking in 2 whole loaves. So the fact that I said hamoitzi, and that the fact that you heard the balabos, you heard me say hamoitzi over 2 loaves of bread, just by hearing me say that, you fulfill your obligation of the Mishnah. Right? And that could have even been before you washed, right? So, by the way, personally, I tried to do this if the guest, if I mishai that the guest won't be insulted. There's a problem because you have a lot of people at the table and everyone goes to wash, and the value you're waiting 3 minutes in between when I washed and said hamoitzi, right? So that's not very ideal. You're supposed to wash and say hamoitzi right away. So what I try to do is that I indeed do that. I go and wash and say hamoitzi right away, even while people are still lining up to wash. They hear me say hamoitzi, and thereby they're yotze their own lechem mishnah. Their mitzvah lechem mishnah, and then when they come, they'll say their own bracha hamoitzi over the slice of challah that I cut for them. That's halachically the better way to do it. You obviously have to be careful not to offend people. Now, an even better way to do it would be for everybody to have their own lechem mishnah. And outside of Chabad, it's much more common practice that they set the table in a way that everybody has 2 little bulkalach in front of them to say their own lechem mishnah. But one thing you have to be very careful about is that if you're saying Hamotzi and Lachamishna, and other people are not going to say their own bracha, they're going to be Yotze Hamotzi from you, then you have to make sure that you and everybody else is already sitting down. So then it's very important if people are lining up to wash, or your plate is here and your challah is here, and it's just easier for you to reach over like that. It doesn't work. You have to make sure everybody's sitting down for the bracha of Hamotzi if they're not going to say their own Hamotzi. Now, then he says, different law applies concerning all eating and drinking that are obligatory, independent of the person deriving benefit. For example, eating matzah on the first night of Pesach, reciting Kiddush over wine, whether at night or during the day of Shabbos and Yom Tov. Right? So he says explicitly that even making Kiddush at day is an obligatory mitzvah, and therefore you can be yotze even if the other person has already done the mitzvah. He doesn't say it here explicitly concerning standing or sitting, but I think he does say it explicitly about standing and sitting also. Let me check. No, it doesn't say it explicitly. He doesn't say explicitly about standing or sitting, but he does say in a couple of places. I just read you one of them. It's also in Hilchos Kiddush, at least in two, possibly in three places, and possibly more. The Alter Rebbe says that even Kiddush of Shabbos day has a status of Birchas HaMitzvah, and therefore there's a few ramifications. First of all, you don't have to sit; you could even stand, chayra, right? Second of all, not like the Brisker of, you don't have to say that everybody's obligated to take a sip of wine, right? Right. Now, practically, what's the Chabad minhag for Shabbos day? Yeah. So it's interesting because the Rebbe used to make Kiddush by the Farbrengens a Shabbos day sitting down. I think he maybe would raise a little bit for the bracha, but that's when he made it sitting down. But there's a few caveats to that observation. Number one, I don't know if always or many times the Rebbe wasn't really making Kiddush. The Rebbe had already made Kiddush earlier, and for whatever, maybe he decided again in case somebody wanted to be Yotze. And you could, perhaps there was some element of the Rebbe sitting down in order to be choshesh to that shitta, to be, if there was anyone being Yotze Kiddush from the Rebbe, to be choshesh to that shitta of sitting down. But I think most important is to point out that it's mistaber that the reason the Rebbe said Kiddush sitting down was because he didn't want to be matriach if the Rebbe would stand up for Kiddush, and everybody would stand up, and the Rebbe didn't want to impose. And the reason why I say that is because the Rebbe made Kiddush, there's one time in the year that the Rebbe made the night Kiddush in public, and that was the night of Simchas Torah. And then the Rebbe also said it sitting down. And that's explicit, the Rebbe writes explicitly in Sefer Minhagim that our minhag is to stand for Kiddush of the night. So even though it's explicit our minhag is to stand for Kiddush of the night, the Rebbe himself did it sitting down, and Bapashta, about Simchas Torah in public, and Bapashta's the reason was because he didn't want to impose on everybody to stand up, and therefore you can't really bring any proof from what the Rebbe did in public with regards to sitting for Kiddush. And according to many testimonies, it seems that the Rebbe, when he made Kiddush in private on Shabbos day, whether it was the Rebbe was listening, or even when he was just making Kiddush for himself, that the Rebbe did say it standing up, did say Kiddush standing up. And also Mipi Hashmua, in other words, rumor has it that this is one of the issues there's a few things like this, there was a little bit of a machlokes, so to speak, between the Rebbe's minhag that he saw witnessed by his father versus what the Frierdiker Rebbe said. And often the Rebbe sort of tried to synthesize or to do a bit of both. So apparently the Rebbe's father would say Kiddush by day standing up, but the Frierdiker Rebbe would say it sitting down. So perhaps in public, the Rebbe did what the Frierdiker Rebbe did, but in his personal life, so to speak, he did what his father did. That's a possible explanation. There are other examples of this. For example, Shalom Aleichem and Eishes Chayil, when Shabbos falls on Yom Tov, yeah? So in Hayom Yom it says that when Shabbos falls on Yom Tov, you say Shalom Aleichem and Eishes Chayil quietly, right? But in the first edition of Hayom Yom, which was printed in 1944, the it said that when Shabbos was Yom Tov, you don't say it. And later it was changed to you say it quietly. And I believe that was also something that the Frierdiker Rebbe said not to say it, but the Rebbe's father said that you should say it. And so the Rebbe synthesized and said, say it quietly. So that's possible. So Lamaisa, the bottom line is, for Shabbos day, it's our minhag to stand. There's different customs for Shabbos night, it's our explicit minhag to stand, the Chabad minhag, and there seems to be, even within Chabad, different customs as to whether or not everybody says their own Bei Pri Hagafen or not. For Shabbos day, there isn't any explicit Chabad minhag, and there seems to be different reports, but either way, even if you say Kiddush standing up, it's by day it's okay because the Alter Rebbe says that it's considered Birchas Mitzvah, and therefore you can say it standing up, and people can still be yotze and drink the wine, and if they don't want to, they don't have to drink the wine. There's one other point which it's come up a number of times, and I don't remember the halacha l'maisa. What happens if I'm in the middle of my meal? Shabbos day, I'm in the middle of my meal. Friday night. Imagine I'm in the middle of my meal Friday night, and someone comes in and they haven't heard Kiddush yet, and they don't know how to make Kiddush themselves. So then, explicitly, I could get up and say Kiddush for them, and I say Bei Pri Hagafen because that's part of the Kiddush. What happens Shabbos day? I've made Bei Pri Hagafen, I have Kiddush, and then I'm in the middle of my meal, and somebody else comes in who needs to hear Kiddush. Right? So usually they make Kiddush themselves, but sometimes the person doesn't know how to say Kiddush themselves. So can I say Bei Pri Hagafen again for them? Is it an absolute 100% Birchas HaMitzvah that even though I've already been yotze my Bei Pri Hagafen and I'm drinking wine, I could say it for them as well? I seem to recall that it is okay, but again, that's a point which I have to double check. So the bottom line is, there's 2 points I have to double check. Number one is, if somebody comes in the middle of the meal, Shabbos day, can I say Kiddush for them again if they can't do it themselves? And
Why not?
because I've already said Bei Pri Hagafen. Right? I'm in the middle of drinking a cup of wine. I should say Bei Pri Hagafen again? Just for them?
For them.
Yeah?
Why not?
Well, if it was Birchas Hanenim, for sure would not be allowed to. But it's Birchas HaMitzvah. But is it so?
Birchas Hanenim you would be if you're sitting, right?
No, not if I've already said the bracha. For Birchas Hanenim, you need 2 conditions. I need to be sitting, and I need to be making the bracha for myself as well. That's the first thing we said, right? And the second thing which I'm not sure about is that in order for me to be motzi somebody else with the bracha achrona, with the ber nefashos ala michya, is it absolutely ma'akev even b'diavad that we have to be sitting down? So those are the 2 points which I have to double check. And I'll report back to you next
Isn't
Sunday.
there a third problem with that? You were already Yotze Midaraisa, and he's on, and so you would only
No,
be
that's
making
Friday night. That's it.
what?
You're talking about Friday night.
Well, that's solid for women because they light Shabbos candles, so that's considered
It's a kasher
for
of
the guy who's completely not from, who comes.
The mice of the minhag is there's a pilpul of kivei. I don't know. Yeah, whatever. There's different ways to find for the question, but the mice that's halacha shchonach.
Okay. Anyway, the thing